Harold Yoder woke before the roosters the way he had for 76 years. The house was still dark, the old floorboards cold under his bare feet. He pulled on yesterday's trousers, a flannel shirt that smelled faintly of the barn that no longer had cows, and walked the long hallway that used to echo with children's feet and now only carried the click of his own. At the kitchen threshold he stopped. The table was buried under Amazon boxes, half-eaten bags of Takis, and a stack of ring light equipment. Brad's voice drifted in from the living room, loud enough to wake the dead. "No, bro, the listing says authentic Amish experience, so we're charging $280 a night. Yeah, the old man sleeps in the back, he don't mind." Harold minded. He minded that the parlor grand piano his wife Ruth had played every evening was now draped with fairy lights and a fake butter churn for the Airbnb photos. He minded that the root cellar had become a wine cave for city guests who left their Pinot bottles half full and their cigarette butts in Ruth's canning jars. He minded most of all that the bedroom he and Ruth had shared for 51 years now belonged to strangers who paid Brad and Stacy through an app Harold didn't understand. He poured himself coffee from a pot that had been made at 4 p.m. the day before and walked out onto the back porch. The October sky was the color of a fresh bruise. The corn had been combined weeks ago by the neighbor who rented the land now. Harold's hands remembered the weight of a milk can, the rhythm of a two-bottom plow behind a team of Belgians, the hush of a barn at 5 a.m. when the only sound was the soft rush of milk into the strainer. Inside, Brad yelled, "Dad, turn that Lawrence Welk garbage down. We've got paying guests tonight." Harold had the volume at 9.
He went back in, crossed the living room without a word, and switched the television off at the wall. The screen died mid-polka. Brad sat up on the leather sectional that had replaced Ruth's horsehair sofa. "Seriously, old man? I told you 8 o'clock is checkout for my cleaning crew." Harold looked at his daughter Stacy, curled on the other end of the sectional in pajama shorts and one of Brad's company t-shirts, Brad Hunsicker Construction, We Raise the Bar. She met his eyes for half a second and then studied her phone again. Harold spoke the way plain people do when they finally decide something is finished. "I'll be in my room." He said it soft, almost kind, the way you speak to a horse that's about to be led away. Brad laughed. "Yeah, good idea." Harold walked the long hallway to the cold back bedroom that had once been the sewing room. He shut the door, turned the little brass hook that Ruth had installed in 1974 because the grandchildren liked to burst in unannounced, and opened the pine wardrobe. Inside, on the top shelf behind Ruth's stacked quilts, was a heavy manila envelope marked in her neat schoolteacher hand. "House papers. Do not touch until I am gone." Ruth had been gone 9 years. Harold sat on the narrow iron bed, opened the envelope, and took out the warranty deed. Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, parcel 32.00789.0001. Grantee, Harold K. Yoder and Ruth S. Yoder, husband and wife, as tenants by the entirety. After Ruth passed, the whole title had vested in Harold alone. Below the deed was the satisfaction of mortgage, stamped "Paid in Full, July 12, 2005. Beneath that, a single sheet Harold himself had printed last winter from the Lancaster County Court website, Form LT-10, Complaint in Ejectment or Eviction for Non-Payment or Holdover Tenants. He had highlighted the part that said an owner who has never charged rent can still terminate a tenancy at will with 10 days written notice. He folded everything back into the envelope, tucked it under his arm, and did something he hadn't done since he was 22 and courting Ruth. He left the house without telling a soul where he was going. He drove the old Silverado into Lancaster City,
parked behind the courthouse on Duke Street and walked up the wide limestone steps like a man going to preaching. Inside the prothonitor's office, he paid $87.50 in cash, filled out the forms in block letters, and asked for the constable to serve that very afternoon. The clerk, a woman young enough to be one of his granddaughters, looked at the address and then at Harold's suspenders and straw hat. "Mr. Yoder, this is your own house." "Ja," he said, "it is." He was back home by 2 o'clock, sitting on the porch rocker with a glass of netto tea when Constable Lapp's white pickup rolled up the lane. Brad came to the door in basketball shorts, scratching his belly. "What's this?" Constable Lapp handed him the thick packet. "Service of process. Harold K. Yoder versus Bradley Hunsicker, Stacy Hunsicker, and all other occupants. 10 days to vacate."
Brad's face went the color of pickled beets. "This is a joke, right?" Harold rocked once, twice. No joke. Stacy appeared behind Brad, eyes wide. "Dad!" Harold stood. His knees popped like green kindling. 10 days. After that, the sheriff will remove you and your belongings to the curb. That's the law. Brad started yelling, something about rights and lawyers, and you can't throw your own daughter out. Harold walked past them into the house, down the hall, and closed the sewing room door. He turned the little brass hook again. That night, he slept in his truck at the Sheets on Route 30, seat reclined, quilt over his legs. He woke at 4, drove to the Turkey Hill and Lidditz, and used the payphone to call the number on the brochure he had picked up 3 weeks earlier. Garden Spot Village, Independent Living Apartments. The saleswoman, Miriam, recognized the name. "Mr. Yoder, we've been holding apartment 214 for you since you paid the deposit. Are you ready?" "I'm ready." By noon the next day, Harold had signed a 1-year lease, handed over a cashier's check for the entrance fee, money he'd quietly saved from selling the milking herd in 2011, and received the keys to a 2-bedroom unit overlooking the putting green. He moved in with 3 boxes, 2 suits of plain clothes, Ruth's Bible, and the pine wardrobe quilt. Back at the farmhouse, the screaming had already started. Brad blew up Harold's flip phone, the one he'd only ever used for cattle auction results. "You're putting your grandkids on the street, old man." Harold texted back once. "The grandkids are welcome to visit me at Garden Spot any Sunday after church. Bring cookies." Then he turned the phone off. Day 3, the Wi-Fi went dark. Harold had called Spectrum from the landline at Garden Spot and canceled the account that was in his name only. Day 4, the water heater stopped working. Brad discovered it ran on propane delivered to an account Harold had closed. Day 6, Stacy showed up at Garden Spot in tears, mascara running down her cheeks like rain on a window. Harold met her in the lobby because residents aren't allowed to give out apartment numbers to non-residents. "Daddy, please, Brad's talking about bankruptcy. The Airbnb reviews are tanking. We have nowhere to go." Harold looked at his only daughter, the little girl who used to ride on the hay wagon in a pink dress, and felt something crack inside his chest. But the crack did not break him. "Stacy, when your mom and I needed help after the stroke, you said you were too busy with the business. When I couldn't climb the silo anymore, Brad said hiring help would eat the profit. You've had 10 years in my house rent-free. That's long enough for any person to stand on their own 2 feet. Stacy sobbed. "But we're family." "Family don't treat family like hired help that don't get wages." He reached into his pocket and took out a folded sheet he had prepared that morning. "Here's a list of 3-bedroom rentals in Mannheim School District under $1,200 a month. There's a church fund that helps with first month's rent if you fill out the form. And here," he handed her a second paper, "is the website for Lancaster County Career Link. They got classes for medical billing. You were always good with numbers." Stacy stared at the papers like they were written in Chinese. Harold softened just a little. "You can do this, girl. You're Ruth Stoltzfus's daughter. We don't lay down." On day 10, the magistrate hearing lasted 8 minutes.
Brad showed up with a public defender who tried to argue equitable interest. The judge, a woman who had bought quilt raffle tickets from Ruth for 30 years, looked at the deed, looked at Harold sitting quietly on the wooden bench in his black vest, and muttered, "Case dismissed. Possession to plaintiff immediately."
Cursed so loud the bailiff started walking toward him. Harold never raised his voice. 2 days later, the sheriff's deputies arrived at 8 a.m. sharp with a moving truck Harold had hired and paid for out of his own pocket. He was not cruel, only finished. Brad tried to block the door. One deputy simply moved him aside the way you move a gate. Harold stood on the porch in his new navy blue suspenders. Garden Spot had a dress code for man, no straw hats indoors, and watched his daughter carry out the last box of her children's toys. Stacy's eyes were red but dry. When the truck pulled away, Harold walked through every room. The house smelled of vanilla candles and city people. He opened every window. October wind rushed in like a baptism. He spent the next week cleaning. He pulled the fairy lights down, rolled up the fake Persian rugs, carried the butter churn to the burn barrel. He scrubbed the pine floors with Murphy's oil soap until they glowed the color of honey. He moved Ruth's piano back to the parlor and sat down to play Beautiful Savior for the first time in 9 years. His fingers remembered. On Sunday, he invited his 3 grandchildren, ages 9, 11, and 14, for supper. They arrived with Stacy, who stood uncertainly on the porch until Harold said, "Come in, daughter. The table's big enough when people act right." They ate chicken pot pie and shoe fly. The children asked if they could still ride the pony. There was no pony anymore, and Harold told them about the miniature horse barn at Garden Spot. They begged to visit. He said yes. After the dishes, Stacy lingered in the kitchen. "Daddy, I'm sorry." Harold dried his hands on a dish towel that had belonged to his mother. "I know you are. Sorry don't fix the past, but it can sweeten the future. You're welcome here first Sunday of every month, same as always. Bring the children. Leave the yellin' at home." She nodded, eyes shining. That winter, Harold sold the farm at auction for $1.4 million to a young Mennonite family who wanted to raise their 8 children in the old way. He kept 2 acres and the house for himself, put the rest into a trust managed by a lawyer in Lidditz, and moved the remainder of his belongings into the farmhouse permanently. He had decided the Garden Spot apartment was fine for Florida winters, but a man needs his own dirt under his feet. Every other Wednesday evening, the parlor filled with gray-haired women from the church circle. Harold served coffee and spice cake, while a quiet attorney named Roman explained revocable trusts, ladybird deeds, and why you never add a child's name to the house just in case. The women took notes. Some of them cried. All of them left straighter. One spring evening in 2026, Harold sat on the same porch where the whole thing had started. The fields were green with winter wheat. A plain buggy rolled past. The driver lifted a hand in greeting. Harold lifted his back. Inside, the piano waited. He went in, lifted the lid, and began to play Ruth's favorite hymn. The notes floated out the open windows and over the fields the way they had for 51 years, only now there was no one to tell him to turn it down. The house was quiet, the way a house is supposed to be when it belongs finally and completely to the man who built it with his own hands and paid for it with milk checks and prayer. Harold played until the stars came out, then closed the lid, turned off the lamp, and went to bed in the big front room that had always been his and Ruth's.
Before he fell asleep, he whispered into the dark the way he had every night for 9 years. Only this time, the words were different. "I'm home, Ruth, and nobody's sending me to my room again."